Naomi Brooks had become a master of invisibility, gliding through the gilded corridors of the Lansbury Hotel with a quiet efficiency that allowed her to serve champagne to individuals who couldn't even be bothered to remember her name. But one particular night, billionaire Edward Lansbury strode into his own restaurant, a cruel smile playing on his lips and a mocking glint in his eyes. He presented her with an offer specifically designed to humiliate, $100,000 if she could serve him in Chinese. As the entire dining room fell into a hushed silence, cameras appeared, and nervous laughter echoed off the crystal chandeliers. Everyone waited for the poor waitress to stumble and fail. However, there was one crucial detail that Edward Lansbury was completely unaware of about the woman holding his water glass. She wasn't just another anonymous face in the service industry. She was the daughter of a man whose legacy he had shamelessly stolen. And now, every word she spoke in those 9 flawless languages would become the first crack in his carefully constructed empire. But just before we get back to that, I'd love to know where you're watching from. And if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The evening air was thick with the intoxicating blend of expensive perfume and well-aged wine as Naomi Brooks navigated gracefully between the tables of the Lansbury Hotel's rooftop restaurant. 28 stories above the bustling Manhattan streets, the glittering space buzzed with conversations in at least half a dozen languages. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, inviting light across pristine white tablecloths, and the breathtaking skyline stretched endlessly beyond the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows. Naomi expertly balanced a tray with practiced ease, her dark hair pulled back into a neat, professional bun, her white blouse impeccably pressed and spotless. She'd been working here for 2 years now, ever since her world had tragically fallen apart. The job provided just enough to cover rent and contribute, although barely, to her mother's mounting medical bills. Over time, she'd learned to move through these rooms like a shadow, virtually unnoticed and unheard, which was exactly how the wealthy guests preferred their servers to be. "Excuse me, miss," called a woman from table 7. Naomi approached with a polite, professional smile. "Yes, ma'am. How can I help you?" The woman, draped in shimmering pearls, rattled off a quick sentence in French to her companion before finally turning her attention to Naomi. "We'd like to know if the duck is prepared traditionally or with some fusion twist." Naomi responded in fluent French, explaining the precise preparation method with perfect pronunciation and impeccable grammar. The woman's eyebrows shot up in surprise, and she exchanged a quick, impressed glance with her dining partner before offering a curt nod. Naomi took their order and moved away, acutely aware that even her competence could sometimes feel like an unwelcome intrusion to people of this caliber. She returned to the service station where Leia Chan, the hotel manager, was carefully reviewing seating charts. Leia, a composed woman in her 40s, possessed sharp eyes that missed absolutely nothing. She had always been kind to Naomi in a distant, professional manner. "Busy night ahead," Leia said quietly. "Mr. Lansbury is dining here tonight with investors." Naomi's hands paused momentarily as she organized napkins. Edward Lansbury, the owner himself, rarely made an appearance in his own hotel's restaurant, preferring to conduct business from his penthouse office or jet off to one of his numerous properties around the world. "I'll make sure everything runs smoothly," Naomi replied. Leia studied her for a moment, her expression unreadable. "He can be difficult. Don't take anything personally." Before Naomi could respond, a palpable shift rippled through the restaurant. Conversations dropped to hushed whispers. The pianist's fingers hesitated on the keys before resuming with renewed vigor. Edward Lansbury had arrived. He swept in with an entourage consisting of 4 imposing bodyguards and half a dozen people in obscenely expensive suits. Edward was a striking figure at 50, tall and angular, with silver hair slicked back and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. British by birth but American by choice, he carried himself with the unwavering confidence of someone who hadn't been told no in decades. "Table 12, of course," he announced, not even bothering to ask. The hostess scrambled to accommodate him, even though the table was clearly reserved for another party. Edward dropped into his chair as if he owned the very air itself, which technically he did. Naomi was assigned to his section. She approached with a water pitcher and menus, "Good evening, Mr. Lansbury. Welcome." He glanced up at her, his eyes sliding dismissively over her face without really seeing her. "Water, no ice. And tell the kitchen I want the chef to personally oversee my meal tonight. None of this assembly line nonsense." "Of course, sir," Naomi replied. Naomi poured his water with steady hands, careful not to spill a drop. One of the men at Edward's table chuckled. "Still demanding perfection everywhere you go, Edward. Why settle for less?" Edward retorted, his accent a distinctive blend of British refinement and American directness. "I didn't build an empire by accepting mediocrity." He waved dismissively toward Naomi. "That'll be all." She retreated, feeling the familiar weight of invisibility settle over her shoulders once again. This was the life she'd chosen, or rather the life that had chosen her after her father tragically died. After the university informed her that, without his income, her scholarship simply wasn't enough. After the medical bills started piling up for her mother's treatments. The evening progressed with the usual monotonous rhythm. Naomi moved seamlessly between tables, taking orders, delivering dishes, and refilling glasses. At table 9, a group of diplomats engaged in a lively discussion about international trade agreements in rapid-fire French. She understood every single word but maintained a neutral and professional expression. Then, she heard Edward's voice cut sharply through the ambient noise. "A waitress who speaks French. What's next? Sanskrit?" Naomi turned. Edward was looking directly at her, a mischievous smirk playing on his lips. His entire table had fallen silent, all eyes now focused intently on her. She realized she must have been overheard responding to the diplomats in their native language. "I apologize if I overstepped, sir," Naomi said quietly, her tone even. "Oh, no apology needed," Edward continued, his voice louder now, clearly performing for his captivated audience. "It's just surprising. Tell me, where did a waitress learn French? Community college? Online videos?" His guests laughed uncomfortably. The diplomat who'd spoken to her in French shifted uncomfortably in his seat, looking away. No one wanted to contradict Edward Lansbury in his own establishment. Naomi felt heat rise in her chest, but she kept her face calm and composed. A voice echoed in her memory, her father's voice from years ago. "Respect is not what they give, it's what you carry." "I picked it up over the years," she replied simply. "Will there be anything else?" Edward leaned back in his chair, warming to his game now. Several nearby tables had stopped eating to watch the unfolding exchange. "You know what? This gives me an idea for some after-dinner entertainment." He pulled out his wallet with exaggerated slowness, extracting a crisp $50 bill. He held it up like a prize. "I'll give $50 to anyone on staff who can spell entrepreneur correctly." "Anyone?" A busboy near the kitchen door looked down at his feet, suddenly engrossed in the floor. A hostess pretended to be deeply engaged with her computer screen. Edward laughed. "Come now, don't be shy. Easy money." He turned his attention back to Naomi. "What about you? Feel lucky?" Before she could respond, Leia appeared at Edward's elbow, her face etched with concern. "Mr. Lansbury, perhaps we should focus on your dinner experience. The chef has prepared something special." "I'm sure he has," Edward said, waving her off dismissively. He was enjoying this far too much to stop now. His eyes fixed on Naomi again, and something in his expression sharpened. "Actually, I have a better idea. Tell you what, I'll give you $100,000 if you can serve me in Chinese. Mandarin, specifically. Think you can handle that?" The restaurant fell completely silent. Even the piano player's hands stilled above the keys. The number hung in the air like a challenge and an insult all rolled into one. Naomi stood perfectly still, meeting Edward's cold gaze. His smirk widened. He was absolutely certain she'd either refuse outright or embarrass herself trying. Either way, he'd prove his point about knowing one's place. Her mind raced. $100,000 would cover 6 months of her mother's treatment. It would give her some much-needed breathing room, maybe even allow her to go back to school part-time. But more than the money, something deeper stirred inside her. a memory of standing beside her father at the United Nations, watching him bridge entire cultural divides with nothing but words and empathy. She could take this man's money and endure his mockery, or she could simply walk away and let him think he'd won. "Naomi?" Leia whispered urgently, close enough that only she could hear. "Don't engage. He does this to everyone. It's not worth your job." Naomi nodded slowly, but her eyes never left Edward's. She saw the certainty there, the absolute belief that he'd cornered her, that she was just another prop in his pathetic performance of superiority. "I'll consider your generous offer, Mr. Lansbury," she said finally, her voice steady and controlled. "For now, would you like to hear the evening specials?" Edward's smirk faltered for just a split second. He'd expected either immediate capitulation or outright refusal. This measured, unexpected response threw him completely off balance. "The specials? Fine." He waved his hand impatiently. "Make it quick." Naomi described each dish with professional precision, then took his order and those of his guests. As she walked away, she could feel Edward's eyes following her, reassessing and judging. The rest of her shift passed in a blur. She served meals, cleared plates, and smiled politely at patrons who barely even saw her. But inside, something had irrevocably shifted. Edward Lansbury had intended to humiliate her, to put her firmly in what he considered her place. Instead, he'd reminded her of everything she'd been forced to set aside. When her shift ended near midnight, Naomi boarded the subway home to her small, cramped apartment in Queens. The contrast between the glittering hotel and her humble neighborhood was jarring. Cracked sidewalks replaced polished marble floors. The enticing scent of expensive cuisine gave way to the pervasive smell of fried food emanating from the bodega on the corner. She climbed 3 flights of stairs to her apartment and locked the door securely behind her. The space was tiny but meticulously clean, decorated sparsely with remnants of her old life. Books in multiple languages lined makeshift shelves crafted from old boards. A photo of her father stood proudly on the small dining table, frozen in time at a United Nations event, his smile warm and encouraging. Naomi sat down and pulled a dusty notebook from the shelf. She opened it carefully, revealing pages filled with linguistic notes in her own handwriting. Arabic verb conjugations, meticulously drawn Mandarin characters with pronunciation guides, Swahili phrases, complex Russian grammar rules, the accumulated knowledge of years of passionate study, all tragically abandoned when tragedy struck. She traced her fingers gently over the writing, remembering late nights spent in the university library, her father's unwavering encouragement, the dreams she'd once held of becoming a translator like him, of using language to connect people across cultures, to build understanding where walls currently existed. Her phone sat on the table beside the photo. She picked it up and scrolled through her files until she found the folder marked Dad. Inside were dozens of audio recordings he'd made for her over the years. Study aids, words of encouragement, fascinating stories from his work interpreting at the United Nations. She pressed play on one titled, For When You Doubt. Her father's voice filled the small apartment, warm and familiar, despite the many years since she'd last heard it in person. "Naomi, my brilliant girl, if words can build nations, imagine what your voice could build. You have a gift, not just for language, but for truly listening. That's rarer than you know. When you speak, you don't just translate words, you translate hearts." Tears welled up in her eyes. She missed him with an ache that never fully faded. He had died 3 years ago in a senseless car accident, sudden and unexpected. One moment he was alive, enthusiastically planning her graduation party, and the next he was gone, and with him went the financial support that had made her education possible. Naomi wiped her eyes and stood up. She walked to the small mirror hung beside the door and studied her reflection. The same face Edward Lansbury had dismissed without a second thought. But she knew what he didn't. Behind this ordinary face was a mind that spoke 9 languages fluently, a heart that remembered every lesson her father had taught her about dignity, compassion, and the immense power of being truly heard. She straightened her shoulders and spoke softly in Mandarin, reciting a classical phrase about patience and justice. Her pronunciation was perfect, her tone conveying subtle nuances that most native speakers would even miss. Her reflection looked back at her with newfound determination. Edward Lansbury had thrown down a challenge meant as mockery, but Naomi was going to respond on her own terms, in her own time. Not just for the money, though she desperately needed it, but for something far more important, for her father's cherished memory, for every person who'd ever been dismissed based solely on appearances, and for herself, to prove that she hadn't lost everything when her old life had so tragically crumbled. Tomorrow she would return to that glittering restaurant, and when the moment was right, she would speak. The morning sun barely penetrated the narrow, shadowed streets of Queens as Naomi prepared meticulously for her shift. She'd slept fitfully, her mind replaying Edward Lansbury's mocking challenge and her father's recorded words in equal measure. She dressed with extra care, pressing her white blouse until every crease disappeared, polishing her shoes until they gleamed. As she rode the subway into Manhattan, she listened to another of her father's recordings through her earbuds. This one was from her sophomore year at Columbia when she'd won a regional linguistics competition. "I'm so proud of you, Naomi," his voice said, filled with genuine emotion. "But remember, language is never about showing off. It's about connection. Every single word you speak should build a bridge, not a wall." She arrived at the Lansbury Hotel 45 minutes before her shift was scheduled to begin. The morning crew was already setting up the restaurant, and the space looked noticeably different in the daylight. Less glamorous, more utilitarian. Leia stood near the host stand, carefully reviewing the day's reservations. "You're here early?" Leia observed, her tone neutral, but her eyes betraying her curiosity. "I wanted to be prepared," Naomi replied. "I saw Mr. Lansbury has a private breakfast meeting scheduled." Leia's eyebrows rose slightly. "You're volunteering to serve it, if that's acceptable." There was a long, pregnant pause. Leia studied her intently with those sharp, assessing eyes. "Last night was uncomfortable. Are you sure you want to put yourself in that position again?" Naomi met her gaze steadily, without wavering. "I'm sure." Something shifted in Leia's expression, a flicker of respect or perhaps even recognition. "All right, but Naomi, whatever you're planning, be careful. Edward Lansbury doesn't forgive people who make him look foolish." "I'm not planning anything," Naomi said quietly. "I'm just going to do my job." 2 hours later, Edward arrived with 3 men in impeccably tailored suits, clearly investors or high-powered business partners. They settled at a private table in the corner, surrounded by windows that offered breathtaking views of the sprawling city skyline. Naomi approached with water and menus, her heart beating steadily despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Edward barely glanced at her. "Coffee, black. And tell the kitchen I want the smoked salmon eggs Benedict, but replace the hollandaise with something lighter. I don't need that much butter this early." Naomi wrote down his order, then turned to the other guests to take theirs. As Edward continued discussing business with his associates, she repeated his order back to him to confirm it, but she did so in flawless Mandarin. The words flowed effortlessly, with perfect tonal inflection and precise pronunciation. She used the formal register appropriate for a business setting. Edward's head snapped up, his eyes widening in surprise. His associates looked confused. One of them, an older man with distinguished gray temples, spoke Mandarin and clearly understood what she'd said. His expression registered both surprise and interest. "What was that?" Edward demanded, his voice laced with suspicion. "I was confirming your order, sir," Naomi replied in English, her voice calm and even. "The smoked salmon eggs Benedict with a lighter sauce instead of hollandaise." "You were speaking Chinese." It wasn't a question, but rather a statement, his tone carrying disbelief and irritation in equal measure. "Yes, sir. You mentioned yesterday that you'd pay $100,000 if I could serve you in Chinese. I thought I'd demonstrate that I can." The table fell silent. Edward's jaw tightened visibly. He'd expected her to either completely forget about his challenge or fail spectacularly if she even attempted it. This display of composed competence caught him completely off guard. "Cute trick," he said finally, recovering his composure and his signature smirk. "Parroting back some phrases you memorized." But I said, serve me in Chinese, not imitate me like some trained parrot. Naomi didn't react to the deliberate insult. Instead, she simply pulled out her order pad and began writing the entire order in Mandarin characters, the strokes precise and practiced. When she finished, she showed it to Edward's associate, the one who'd understood her earlier. Is this correct? She asked him in Mandarin, then repeated the question in English. The man examined the writing closely, his expression thoughtful. It's perfect, he said slowly, impressed. Your characters are excellent. Where did you study? Before Naomi could answer, Edward cut in abruptly. That's enough language lessons for one morning. Just bring the food. Naomi nodded and walked away, feeling Edward's eyes boring into her back. She could sense his confusion, the way his mind was desperately recalculating who she might actually be. The other staff members watched her with wide eyes, clearly wondering what had just transpired. In the kitchen, the head chef looked at her order ticket covered in Mandarin characters. What is this? He asked, intrigued. Mr. Lansbury's order, Naomi explained. Same as what I told you in English. The chef shook his head, amused. You're full of surprises, Naomi. As she waited for the food to be prepared, Leia appeared beside her, her eyes filled with curiosity. That was bold. It was honest, Naomi replied simply. Edward looked unsettled. That doesn't happen often. Leia paused, then added quietly, There's more to you than you've let on. Isn't there? Naomi didn't answer directly. We all have stories we don't share at work. The breakfast service proceeded smoothly. Edward ate in tense silence while his associates made polite conversation, carefully avoiding the elephant in the room. When Naomi returned to clear the plates, Edward stopped her. Where did you really learn Mandarin? His tone had shifted from mockery to something harder to read, almost inquisitive. My father was a translator, Naomi said simply. He believed in the power of communication. Was? He passed away 3 years ago? Edward's expression flickered with something that might have been discomfort, but it vanished quickly. Well, knowing a language or two doesn't change your station in life. Remember that. Naomi gathered the plates without responding. As she turned to leave, she overheard Edward's associate say quietly, That was unnecessarily harsh, even for you. Edward's only response was to change the subject back to business. The rest of the morning passed in a strange tension. Word had spread quickly among the staff about the Mandarin exchange, and Naomi felt their curious stares following her every move. She kept her head down and focused diligently on her work, but she was acutely aware of how the dynamic had subtly shifted. She was no longer quite invisible. During her lunch break, she stepped outside for some fresh air. The city noise immediately enveloped her. Car horns blaring, ongoing construction, the rumble of the subway beneath the streets. She found a quiet spot near the hotel's service entrance and pulled out her phone. There was a missed call from Dr. Farooq Hassan, her former mentor from Columbia. She'd studied under him during her undergraduate years before everything had fallen apart. He'd been incredibly kind when she'd had to withdraw, telling her the door was always open if she ever wanted to return. She called him back. Naomi, his warm, familiar voice answered immediately. Thank you for returning my call. I was thinking about you recently. How are you, Dr. Hassan? Busy with the usual academic chaos, but I wanted to ask if you ever finished that research paper you were working on, the one about language as a bridge of empathy. Naomi's throat tightened. That paper had been her passion project, a brilliant combination of linguistics, psychology, and cultural studies. She'd been nearly 3/4 finished when her father died and her world had imploded. No, she said quietly. I never got to complete it. That's a real shame. It was brilliant work, Naomi. Your insights into how multilingual communication affects conflict resolution were genuinely groundbreaking. Thank you. Maybe someday I'll finish it. I certainly hope so. The world needs voices like yours. He paused. Are you doing all right? Really? She looked up at the towering hotel, at the world of unimaginable wealth and power she moved through like a ghost. I'm managing. If you ever want to talk, or if there's anything I can do, you know. Thank you, Dr. Hassan. After they hung up, Naomi stood for a long moment, clutching her phone tightly. The conversation had stirred up painful memories and deep regrets she usually kept carefully buried. Her father's death had stolen more than just his presence. It had stolen her future, or at least the future she'd so vividly imagined. That evening, as she prepared for the dinner shift, she overheard two staff members talking in hushed tones near the supply closet. Did you hear what happened this morning? Naomi totally spoke Chinese to Mr. Lansbury. No way, really? Yeah. And he looked completely thrown off. Someone said she even wrote the whole order in Chinese characters, too. Naomi moved past them without acknowledging the hushed conversation. Let them talk, she thought. It didn't really change anything. But she was wrong. It had changed something. At table 6, a young waiter named Marcus was struggling with a guest who spoke very limited English. The guest was becoming visibly frustrated, his voice rising as he tried to explain something about his food allergy. Marcus looked panicked, completely unable to understand. Naomi recognized the language immediately. Arabic. She approached smoothly. May I help? She asked Marcus quietly. Please. I can't understand what he needs. Naomi turned to the guest and spoke in fluent Arabic, her dialect perfectly matching his. She politely explained that Marcus didn't speak Arabic but was eager to assist him. The guest's face immediately flooded with relief, and he quickly described his severe shellfish allergy. Naomi translated for Marcus, who nodded gratefully and rushed off to inform the kitchen. The guest thanked Naomi profusely in Arabic, his earlier frustration melting away into genuine appreciation. She smiled warmly and assured him they'd take care of everything. As she turned to leave, she found Edward Lansbury standing just 10 feet away, watching her intently. He'd witnessed the entire exchange. Their eyes met across the restaurant floor. His expression was unreadable, but something had definitely shifted in the way he looked at her. No longer dismissive, now calculating, he walked slowly toward her. That was Arabic. Yes, sir. So, you speak Mandarin and Arabic? He said it slowly, as if carefully testing the words. What else? Naomi could have listed them. French, Spanish, Russian, Swahili, Portuguese, Italian. 9 languages in total. Each one learned with love and dedication. Each one a precious gift from her father's unwavering belief in her potential. But something stopped her from revealing everything all at once. Enough to help when needed, she said instead, keeping her answer vague. Edward's eyes narrowed, his gaze piercing. Who are you really? I'm Naomi Brooks. I work here as a waitress. Nobody who speaks like that works as a waitress by choice. The comment stung because it was undeniably true. But Naomi kept her expression perfectly neutral. Life takes unexpected turns. He studied her for another long, intense moment, then abruptly pulled out his phone and typed something quickly. I'm having my assistant look into your background. I don't like mysteries in my establishment. A cold weight settled heavily in Naomi's stomach, but she didn't let it show on her face. You're welcome to look. I have nothing to hide. Edward walked away without another word, but the implicit threat hung ominously in the air. Naomi finished her shift with a growing sense of unease. She'd simply wanted to prove something, to reclaim a small piece of her lost dignity. But now she'd inadvertently drawn unwanted attention to herself, attention she definitely couldn't afford. That night, back in her small apartment, she tossed and turned, unable to fall asleep. She kept replaying Edward's words in her mind. I don't like mysteries. What would his assistant find? Her academic records? Her father's work at the United Nations? The fact. She'd once been on track for a PhD in linguistics before financial ruin forced her to drop out. She got up and opened her laptop, navigating to old files she rarely looked at anymore. There were photos from her university days, papers she'd written, presentations she'd given at academic conferences, evidence of a life she'd once lived. And there, buried in a folder marked Dad's Work, were copies of some of her father's old United Nations documents. Translations he'd done, reports he'd filed. She'd kept them as mementos, never really examining them closely. Now, unable to sleep, She opened one at random. It was a communication protocol document about a multilingual AI project, dated just months before her father died. She'd never paid much attention to it before, but now something caught her eye. At the bottom of the page was a signature, not her father's. Someone else had signed off on the final version. The name made her hands still on the keyboard, Edward Lansbury. She stared at the screen, her mind racing. Why would Edward have been involved in a United Nations linguistic project? His company was tech-focused, but she'd never heard of him working in translation or communication technology, at least not in any official capacity. Naomi pulled up another document, then another. As she dug deeper into her father's files, a pattern emerged. Multiple projects, all related to language and communication technology, all with some connection to Lansbury Tech. Her father had never mentioned working with Edward Lansbury, at least not that she remembered, but these documents suggested otherwise. A chill ran down her spine. Was this coincidence? Or had Edward recognized something about her that she hadn't realized herself? Was that why his challenge last night had felt so specifically pointed? She glanced at the clock. 3 o'clock in the morning. In a few hours, she'd have to return to that restaurant, to that world where Edward Lansbury was beginning to see her as more than just a waitress. And she had no idea what that might mean. Naomi closed the laptop and tried to steady her breathing. Whatever was happening, she'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross. The question now was whether she'd revealed too much or not enough. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. Truth connects. Lies divide. She'd told the truth. She could speak Mandarin. She could speak Arabic. She was more than Edward Lansbury had assumed. But the truth, she was beginning to realize, came with complications she hadn't anticipated. Tomorrow would bring answers or more questions. Either way, Naomi knew one thing for certain. The game had changed, and she was no longer content to remain invisible. She lay back down, staring at the ceiling, and whispered a phrase in Mandarin, a saying her father had taught her years ago. When the student is ready, the teacher appears. She just hoped she was ready for whatever lessons were coming. After discovering Edward's signature on her father's documents, Naomi returned to work the next evening with a knot of anxiety in her chest. She'd barely slept, her mind churning through possibilities and questions that had no easy answers. The restaurant buzzed with unusual energy. A lavish investor dinner was scheduled for tonight, complete with journalists documenting Edward's latest philanthropic initiative. Leia had warned the entire staff that everything needed to be perfect. As Naomi tied her apron in the staff room, one of the other waitresses whispered, "I heard Mr. Lansbury specifically requested you for his table tonight." Naomi's stomach tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. "Then I'd better make sure everything is perfect." The evening crowd arrived in waves of designer suits and cocktail dresses. Camera crews set up in discreet corners, capturing footage for whatever PR campaign Edward was orchestrating. Naomi recognized a few faces from business magazines and news channels. At the center of it all sat Edward Lansbury, holding court like a king among courtiers. His table was the largest, positioned where everyone could see him. A dozen guests surrounded him, including several Chinese investors, a Russian business partner, and representatives from a Middle Eastern investment fund. Naomi approached with water and menus, her movements calm despite the cameras and attention. "Good evening, Mr. Lansbury. Welcome." Edward looked up at her, and she saw calculation in his eyes. Whatever his assistant had found in her background, it had only deepened his interest. "Ah, Naomi, perfect timing." He gestured expansively to his guests. "I was just telling everyone about our fascinating staff here at the Lansbury Hotel. So talented, so diverse." The way he said it made her skin prickle. This was a setup. She distributed menus and poured water, aware of every eye on her. The journalists had noticed Edward's attention and were turning their cameras in her direction. Edward let the anticipation build as his guests perused the menus. Then, just as Naomi finished pouring the last glass, he spoke loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "You know, I made a rather generous offer to our friend Naomi here the other night. $100,000 if she could serve me in Chinese." He paused for effect. She claimed she could speak Mandarin. So, tonight, with all of you as witnesses, let's see if she was telling the truth. The restaurant's ambient noise dropped. Conversations at other tables ceased. Even the piano player seemed to soften his touch on the keys. Edward leaned back in his chair, smirking. Go ahead, Naomi. Take our orders in Mandarin. Let's see how fluent you really are. Every camera in the room swiveled toward her. Naomi felt the weight of dozens of stares, the pressure of the moment. This was no longer about a private challenge. Edward had turned it into a public spectacle, designed to humiliate her if she failed, or to minimize her success if she didn't. But Naomi had learned something from her father. Real power wasn't about dominating others. It was about maintaining your own dignity regardless of circumstances. She took a breath, centered herself, and then spoke in flawless Mandarin. Her words flowed naturally as she addressed the Chinese investors first, using the formal register appropriate for business elders. She welcomed them, asked about their preferences, and explained the evening's specials with perfect tonal inflection. But she didn't stop there. She noted the regional accent of one investor and seamlessly shifted her dialect to match, showing respect for his specific background. When she spoke to another, she incorporated classical idioms about prosperity and good fortune, traditional phrases that delighted the older gentleman. The Chinese investors exchanged glances of genuine surprise. One of them, a woman with silver-streaked hair, responded in Mandarin, "Your accent is remarkable. Where did you study?" Naomi answered smoothly, explaining in Mandarin that her father had been a translator and had taught her from childhood. The conversation continued naturally, with Naomi taking orders and answering questions about the menu with the ease of someone completely comfortable in the language. Edward's smirk had frozen on his face. He'd expected basic phrases, maybe some stumbling attempts at pronunciation. This level of fluency hadn't been in his calculations. The Russian businessman leaned toward Edward and muttered, "Her Mandarin is better than yours, Edward, by a considerable margin." A few guests chuckled nervously. Edward's jaw tightened, his composure cracking. He couldn't let this stand. Couldn't let a waitress outshine him in his own restaurant in front of cameras and investors. "Anyone can memorize phrases," he said sharply, cutting into the conversation. "Let's try something more challenging. Arabic. Speak to our Middle Eastern guests in Arabic." Naomi turned to the three men from the investment fund. She paused for just a moment, letting Edward think she might falter. Then she spoke in fluid Arabic, greeting them with formal politeness and quoting a verse about dignity and truth. The eldest of the three men straightened in his seat, clearly impressed. He responded in Arabic, asking where she'd learned such refined phrasing. Naomi explained about her father's work at the United Nations, how she'd grown up surrounded by diplomats and translators from every corner of the world. The conversation continued for several minutes, with Naomi taking their orders and discussing menu options in Arabic. The men were clearly charmed, their initial skepticism replaced by genuine warmth. By now, more than half the restaurant had stopped eating to watch. Other diners had pulled out their phones, recording the exchange. The journalists were capturing everything, their cameras trained on Naomi's poised face and Edward's increasingly agitated expression. "All right, that's enough," Edward snapped. But one of his other guests, a woman from France, called out in French, asking if Naomi spoke it as well. Naomi responded in perfect Parisian French, then switched to the woman's regional accent when she detected the subtle differences. The French guest laughed with delight. Someone else asked about Spanish. Naomi obliged, her Castilian pronunciation flawless, then Russian, then Swahili, impressing an African entrepreneur who'd been quietly observing from a neighboring table. The restaurant had transformed into something between a performance and a revelation. Guests from other tables called out languages, testing her, and Naomi responded to each with natural competence: Italian, Portuguese. She moved between them with the ease of someone who didn't just speak languages, but lived in them. Edward's face had gone red. His carefully orchestrated evening was slipping from his control, the spotlight shifting from him to the waitress he'd meant to humiliate. "Enough!" His voice cracked like a whip. The room fell silent. This is very impressive, I'm sure. But we're here for dinner, not a circus act. The insult hung in the air. Several guests shifted uncomfortably. One of the journalists, a woman with sharp eyes and a notebook, was scribbling furiously. Edward pulled out his checkbook with sharp, angry movements. He scrawled across it and tore the check free, slapping it on the table. $100,000, just like I promised. But before you take it, prove one more thing. He reached into his briefcase and extracted a document, sliding it across the table toward Naomi. Translate this right here, right now. If you can do it accurately, the money is yours. Naomi picked up the document with steady hands. As her eyes scanned the first page, her blood went cold. It was written in a rare dialect, a specialized form of Mandarin used in certain academic and diplomatic circles. But that wasn't what made her freeze. The document was about linguistic communication algorithms, artificial intelligence, translation protocols, and neural language processing. And in the margins, in handwriting she'd recognize anywhere, were her father's notes. This was her father's work, the research he'd been conducting for the United Nations in the months before he died. She'd seen fragments of it in the files on her laptop, but never the complete document. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the pages. How did Edward have this? Why did he have her father's research? She looked up at him, and something in her expression must have shone through because his smirk widened. He knew this meant something to her. He was testing her, but not in the way everyone else believed. Problem? Edward asked, his tone sharp. Can't read it after all? Naomi's mind raced. She could translate it, every word. She'd helped her father with portions of this research before he died. But doing so would reveal that she recognized it, that she knew exactly what this document was and what it represented. The room waited in breathless silence. Cameras recorded every second. The check sat on the table like a challenge and a trap combined. Naomi made her decision. She began to read aloud, translating from the complex dialect into clear English. Her voice was steady as she explained the technical concepts about using artificial intelligence to break down language barriers, to create systems that could translate not just words, but cultural context and emotional nuance. As she read deeper into the document, she began to notice things. Sections that should have been there were missing. Her father's conclusions about ethical implementation, about ensuring the technology served humanity rather than corporate interests. Those pages were absent. And where her father's signature should have been at the bottom, certifying his work, there was instead a patent application filed under Lansbury Tech's name. Naomi's voice caught for just a moment. Then she continued translating the final sections that outlined how this technology could revolutionize global communication. When she finished, she carefully set the document down and looked directly at Edward. The translation is complete, she said quietly. But this document is incomplete. Sections are missing. Edward's expression flickered with something between surprise and anger. That's not your concern. You were asked to translate, not critique. I'm simply noting that the original research was more comprehensive. She kept her voice level, professional, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. The author had additional conclusions about ethical implementation that aren't included here. And how would you know that? Edward's tone was dangerous now. The entire restaurant held its breath. Naomi stood at a crossroads. She could back down, take the money, and walk away, or she could speak the truth that was burning in her throat. Because my father wrote this, she said clearly. His name was Andre Brooks. He was a United Nations interpreter and researcher, and this was his work. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the city sounds from outside seemed to fade away. Edward's face went through several expressions before settling on cold fury. Your father was a consultant. The intellectual property belongs to Lansbury Tech. We funded the research. Funding doesn't erase authorship, Naomi replied. And it doesn't give you the right to remove the ethical guidelines he established. One of the journalists stood up, her camera still rolling. Other guests were whispering urgently to each other. The Chinese investors looked troubled, clearly recognizing the implications of what had just been revealed. Edward stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This dinner is over. Everyone out now. But no one moved. The spell had been broken, and something larger than a simple dinner had been exposed. Leia appeared at Naomi's side, her presence solid and supportive. "I think you should take your break," she said quietly to Naomi. "I'll handle the rest of the evening." Naomi nodded, her composure finally beginning to crack. She left the check on the table untouched and walked toward the staff area with as much dignity as she could muster. The staff room was empty and blessedly quiet. Naomi sank onto the bench, her whole body trembling now that the adrenaline was fading. She just confronted Edward Lansbury in front of investors, journalists, and cameras. She'd accused him of stealing her father's work. She had no idea what would happen next, but she knew her life had just changed irrevocably. The door opened, and Leia entered, closing it firmly behind her. She sat down beside Naomi without speaking, simply offering her presence. "I'm probably fired," Naomi said, her voice shaking. Maybe not." Leia's tone was thoughtful. "But either way, that took courage." Naomi let out a sound between a laugh and a sob. "Courage or stupidity? I needed this job." "Did you mean what you said about your father writing that document?" "Every word." Naomi looked at Leia, tears finally spilling over. "I didn't know Edward had it. I didn't know he'd patented my father's research under his own company's name. I found his signature on some of my dad's old files just last night, but I didn't understand the full scope until I saw that document." Leia was quiet for a long moment. Then she spoke carefully. "I worked for Lansbury Tech once in public relations about 5 years ago." Naomi turned to look at her fully. "I left because of an ethics scandal." Leia continued. "Edward acquired a small startup, claimed he'd bought all their intellectual property legitimately, but several of the original founders said he'd stolen their work, that he'd forced them out, and then patented their innovations under his name." "What happened?" "The case was settled out of court. Non-disclosure agreements all around, but I couldn't stay after that. I couldn't keep spinning stories to cover up what I knew was theft." Leia met Naomi's eyes. "If your father's work was taken the same way, you deserve to know the truth." "How do I prove it? It's been 3 years, and I'm just a waitress with no resources to fight someone like Edward Lansbury." "You're not just a waitress," Leia said firmly. "You're a linguistic scholar who speaks 9 languages and whose father was a respected UN researcher. That's who you are. Don't let anyone, including yourself, diminish that." Naomi wiped her eyes. "Thank you." A knock at the door made them both turn. Clara Wells, the journalist who'd been taking notes all evening, poked her head in. She was in her mid-30s, with intelligent eyes and an air of determined professionalism. "I'm sorry to intrude. May I speak with you, Naomi?" Naomi looked at Leia, who nodded. Clara entered and closed the door behind her. "That was remarkable," Clara said without preamble. "And I don't just mean your language skills. What you revealed about that document could be significant. Could be." Naomi's voice was hollow. "It won't matter. He's a billionaire. I'm nobody. You're someone who just told the truth in front of cameras and witnesses. That matters." Clara pulled out a business card. "I write for the Times. Human interest stories usually, but I also cover corporate accountability. If you're willing to talk, really talk, I'd like to help you tell your story." "Why would you help me?" "Because I've been watching Edward Lansbury operate for years, and I've never been able to pin down his shadier dealings. But tonight you handed me a thread I can pull." Clara's expression softened. "And because what he did to you tonight was cruel. The whole setup was designed to humiliate you, and instead you showed grace and intelligence and truth. That deserves to be recognized." Naomi looked at the business card, then at Leia, then back to Clara. "If I do this, I'll lose everything. My job, any chance of working in hospitality again, Maybe you'll lose those things," Clara interrupted gently. "Or maybe you'll gain something more important. Justice, recognition, the truth about your father's legacy." The weight of the decision pressed down on Naomi. She thought about her mother's medical bills, about the rent due next week, about the practical realities of survival. But she also thought about her father's voice in those recordings, about his belief that truth was the foundation of all real communication. "I have files," Naomi said slowly. "My father's old research notes, audio recordings where he talks about his work. I don't know if it's enough proof, but it's something." Clara's eyes lit up. "That's exactly what we need. Would you be willing to share them with me?" Naomi pulled out her phone, navigating to the folder of her father's files. She'd backed everything up to cloud storage years ago, just to preserve his memory. Now, those memories might serve a larger purpose. She pulled out a USB drive from her bag. She'd started carrying copies of everything after last night's discovery and handed it to Clara. "This has everything. Audio files, research notes, correspondence. Just in case." "Just in case of what?" Clara asked. "Just in case something happens to me or to the original files. I don't trust Edward not to try something." Clara's expression grew serious. "That's smart thinking. I'll keep this secure." She paused. "For what it's worth, I don't think Edward will retaliate directly. He's too smart for that. But he will try to discredit you. Be prepared for that." "I've been discredited my whole life just by existing," Naomi said quietly. "At least this time it's for speaking truth." After Clara left, Naomi sat alone in the staff room for a long while. Her shift was technically over. She should go home, try to sleep, figure out what came next, but her body felt too heavy to move. Her phone buzzed. A text from Dr. Farouk Hassan. "Naomi, I saw something online. A video from the Lansbury Hotel. Was that you? Please call me when you can." Of course. The videos had already started circulating. Within hours, her confrontation with Edward would probably be everywhere. She called him back. "Naomi." Dr. Hassan's voice was warm but concerned. "What happened tonight?" She explained everything. The challenge, the languages, the document, the revelation about her father's stolen research. It all poured out of her in a rush of words. When she finished, Dr. Hassan was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke carefully. "Naomi, I need to tell you something. I knew your father, not well, but we met several times at conferences. He mentioned working on a communication project funded by a tech company, but he was concerned about how they wanted to use his research." "Concerned how?" "He felt they were more interested in commercial applications than humanitarian ones. He wanted the technology to help refugees, immigrants, people who struggled with language barriers, but the company wanted to monetize it, to create proprietary systems that would require licensing fees." Naomi's hands tightened around her phone. "Did he say which company?" "He never named them specifically, but he did say the CEO was a man who saw language as a commodity rather than a bridge." Dr. Hassan paused. "Based on what you've told me, I think he was talking about Edward Lansbury. Why didn't you tell me this before?" "I didn't connect it until tonight. And honestly, after your father died, I assumed the project had been abandoned." His voice grew firmer. "But if Edward patented your father's work, if he's using it without proper attribution or adhering to your father's ethical guidelines, that's not just wrong. It's theft of intellectual property." "How do I prove that?" "The documents you have are a start, but you'll need more. Academic papers your father published, correspondence, anything that shows his original intent and authorship." Dr. Hassan hesitated. "Naomi, this could get complicated. Edward Lansbury has resources and lawyers. Are you prepared for that fight?" "I don't know," she admitted, "but I can't let my father's work be erased. I can't let Edward profit from something he stole while pretending it was his innovation. Then I'll help however I can. I still have connections in the academic community, people who knew your father's work. We can build a case for proper attribution at minimum." After the call ended, Naomi finally forced herself to stand. She changed out of her work uniform, folded it carefully, and left it in her locker. She didn't know if she'd be coming back tomorrow. The subway ride home felt surreal. She kept expecting to feel regret or fear, but instead, she felt a strange sense of clarity. For 3 years, she'd been hiding, surviving, diminishing herself to fit into spaces that didn't value her. Tonight, she'd stopped hiding. Back in her apartment, she opened her laptop and pulled up all of her father's files. She organized them methodically, Research notes, audio recordings, email correspondence, conference presentations, everything that proved Andre Brooks had been working on multilingual AI communication systems years before Edward Lansbury claimed the innovation. As she worked, she played one of her father's recordings. His voice filled the small apartment, talking about his vision for the project. Language shouldn't be a barrier, Naomi. It should be a bridge. This technology. We're developing something that could help millions connect across cultures, but only if it's used ethically and with respect for the communities it serves. I'm really worried about my partners, though. They keep going on about market share and licensing agreements. They just don't get that some things are way more important than making a profit. Naomi paused the recording, tears just pouring down her face. Her dad had known. He'd known that Edward and his company couldn't be trusted with this work. And then he'd passed away, and Edward had just taken everything. She started the recording again. If anything happens to me, I need you to know where all my research is stored. I've kept backup copies of absolutely everything, including the ethical guidelines that I insisted on. They're in the UN archives under project designation LB20-00047. Remember that number, Naomi, LB200047. That's proof of what this project was always meant to be. Naomi actually stopped breathing for a second. Her father had left a trail, hard evidence stored in official archives that would prove his original work, his ethical framework, basically everything Edward had taken out or changed. She grabbed her phone and texted Dr. Hassan. My father mentioned UN Archives Project LB200047. Can you help me get access to those records? His response came back almost immediately. I can try. I'll reach out to my contacts at the UN tomorrow. This could be exactly what we need. Naomi looked around her small apartment, at the life she'd managed to build from the ruins of her dreams. Tomorrow, everything could change completely again. Edward would almost definitely try to trash her reputation. The videos from tonight would be all over social media, and people would be judging and commenting and dissecting every single thing. But for the first time in 3 years, Naomi felt like herself again. Not just a waitress hiding her past. Not a scholar forced into silence, but someone willing to speak the truth no matter what it cost her. She picked up her father's photo from the table and spoke to him quietly. I'm going to finish what you started, Dad. I'm going to make sure your work finally gets the recognition it deserves. And I'm going to make absolutely sure that Edward Lansbury can't erase you from history. The city was humming outside her window. Somewhere out there, Edward was probably already planning his next move. Clara was likely writing her article. The world was changing in ways Naomi couldn't even begin to predict. But she was ready for the truth, for justice, for whatever was coming. She pulled up the video that someone had already posted online. The clip showed her speaking in multiple languages, totally calm and collected, while Edward was just getting more and more worked up. The comment section was blowing up with reactions. Who is this woman? She just destroyed that arrogant billionaire with pure class. This is what real intelligence looks like. Wait, did she say he stole her father's research? Someone needs to look into this. Naomi closed her laptop. The story was basically writing itself. Now, she just had to make sure that the truth didn't get buried under all of Edward's money and influence. She lay down on her bed, exhausted, but totally unable to sleep. Tomorrow would definitely bring consequences. But tonight, she'd honored her father's memory and her own integrity. And that, she decided, was enough. The viral videos from the restaurant had been circulating for 3 days when Naomi got an unexpected call from Edward Lansbury's personal assistant. She was sitting in her apartment, going over documents with Dr. Hassan on a video call, when her phone buzzed with an unknown number. Ms. Brooks? Mr. Lansbury would like to extend a personal invitation to dinner at his residence tomorrow evening at 7 p.m. He wishes to apologize for the misunderstanding and discuss a potential opportunity with Lansbury Tech. Naomi's grip tightened on her phone. An opportunity? Mr. Lansbury is incredibly impressed by your linguistic abilities. He'd like to discuss sponsoring your talents through our new AI communication division. After she hung up, Dr. Hassan's face on the laptop screen showed real concern. Naomi, this feels like a trap. I know. But maybe it's also a chance to get more information, to figure out what he really wants. Or it's a chance for him to intimidate you in private, away from cameras and witnesses. Naomi thought about that for a second. Then I'll make sure someone knows exactly where I am and when to expect me back. She called Leia, who immediately voiced the same concerns. It's not an apology, Naomi. It's a test. Edward doesn't apologize. He manipulates people. What would you do? Leia was quiet for a moment. I'd go, but I'd record everything, and I'd tell multiple people exactly where you are and when you'll check in. The next evening, Naomi stood outside Edward's penthouse building in Tribeca. The building was all glass and steel, just towering over the whole neighborhood like some kind of monument to wealth. She dressed carefully in simple black pants and a white blouse, professional, but not trying too hard to impress him. A doorman escorted her to a private elevator that opened right into Edward's penthouse. The space was just breathtaking. Floor-to-ceiling windows offering these panoramic city views, minimalist furniture, and walls covered with awards and artifacts from all over the world. African masks right next to Chinese pottery next to what looked like ancient Greek fragments. Objects that he'd clearly collected without really understanding them, just displaying them without any context. Edward came out of a hallway, dressed in casual slacks and a button-down shirt. His smile was warm, but it didn't actually reach his eyes. Naomi, thank you so much for coming. Please sit. He gestured to a dining area where champagne was sitting, chilling in a bucket. I thought we could clear the air. The other night definitely got out of hand. It was certainly memorable, Naomi replied, not sitting down yet. Edward poured 2 glasses of champagne, offering her one. She took it but didn't drink. He noticed, and his smile tightened just a little. I'll be direct with you. You impressed me. Your linguistic abilities are extraordinary, and I was completely wrong to dismiss them or you so casually. He sipped his champagne. I want to make amends for that. Lansbury Tech is developing a new AI communication platform. We need someone with your skills, your deep understanding of cultural nuance. I'd like to offer you a position as our chief linguistic consultant. Naomi studied him carefully. That's generous of you, but I'm really curious why you'd offer a job to someone who publicly accused you of stealing her father's research. Edward's jaw tightened just a fraction. That was a misunderstanding born from emotion. Your father consulted on a project that we funded. We own the intellectual property, which is just standard business practice. But I totally understand why you were upset. Where I come from, we call authorship what it is. My father created that research. Your signature on the patent doesn't change who actually did the work. Your father was very well compensated for his time. Was he? Naomi's voice was still calm. Because after he died, we didn't receive anything. No residuals, no recognition. Nothing that even acknowledged his 3 years of work. Edward's artificial warmth was starting to fade away. He was a consultant. Consultants don't receive royalties. And yet you've made millions off of his algorithms. The temperature in the room seemed to drop a couple of degrees. Edward set down his glass with more force than was really necessary. Let's discuss this somewhere a little more private. He led her to a study, lined with mahogany shelves and leather-bound books. A large desk was dominating the space, covered with folders and documents. Edward closed the door behind them. I'll be honest with you now, he said, his voice much harder. Those videos from the restaurant have caused some serious problems. Investors are asking questions. My board is concerned about the optics. I need this situation resolved. Resolved how? He slid a folder across the desk toward her. This is a contract. You'll receive a substantial signing bonus, a very generous salary, and the title that I mentioned to you. In exchange, you'll sign a statement acknowledging that your father's work was done under contract to Lansbury Tech, and that all intellectual property rightfully belongs to the company. Naomi opened the folder. The contract was thick, filled with legal jargon, but she spotted the key clauses pretty quickly. Non-disclosure agreements, non-disparagement clauses, a complete waiver of any future claims related to her father's work. This isn't a job offer. It's a silencing agreement. It's a resolution, one that benefits everyone involved. Edward's tone was growing sharper by the second. Do you even understand what you're up against here? I have attorneys who could tie you up in court for years. I could destroy your credibility with a single press release. That journalism friend of yours. One call from my PR team and her article never sees the light of day. Clara isn't afraid of you. Everyone should be afraid of me. Edward leaned forward, his mask just slipping completely. You're just a waitress with no money, no connections, and no real proof of anything. Your father's dead. His notes are circumstantial at best. Meanwhile, I have patents, I have contracts, and I have a legal team that's never lost. Naomi met his gaze steadily. She'd come totally prepared for this. In her pocket, her phone was recording every single thing. Clara was waiting for a check-in call. Dr. Hassan had backup copies of all the files, and most importantly, they'd found the UN archives that morning. Project LB 200047 contained her father's original research, complete with his ethical guidelines that Edward had removed. You're right, I don't have your resources, Naomi said quietly. But I have something that you don't have. I have the truth, and the willingness to speak it no matter what the cost is. Edward's face just flushed bright red. The truth? You want to talk about the truth? Your father was brilliant. I'll give him that. But he was incredibly naive. He actually thought language should be free, accessible to absolutely everyone. He didn't understand that innovation requires investment, that nothing worthwhile is ever free. So you stole his work and erased his name from it. I acquired intellectual property through perfectly legal means. Edward's voice was really rising now. He signed contracts. He knew the terms. Did he know you'd remove every single mention of ethics? That you'd turn his humanitarian vision into a profit machine? Business requires pragmatism. Your father wanted to just give away technology that cost millions to develop. I turned it into something viable, something that actually exists in the world, rather than just dying as some idealistic dream. Naomi stood up slowly. Inside her pocket, her phone was capturing every single word. My father believed that language was a bridge. You've turned it into a commodity. That's not pragmatism. It's a betrayal. Get out. Edward's composure just shattered completely. He grabbed his champagne glass and hurled it against the wall. The crystal shattered, and champagne went streaming down the expensive wallpaper. You people think that knowing a few words makes you equal. You think you can just walk into my world and demand respect. You're nothing. The words echoed in the study. Naomi stood perfectly still, just watching him completely unravel. This was the real Edward Lansbury, not the polished billionaire, but the insecure man underneath, who needed to diminish others in order to feel powerful. You're right, she said softly, switching to Mandarin. I am nothing by your standards, but empires always fall when they stop listening. She walked to the door and opened it. Edward stood frozen, his face twisted with rage and something else. The dawning realization that he'd just revealed his true self completely. Naomi left without another word, her hand steady on the recording device in her pocket. As the elevator descended, she just exhaled slowly. Tomorrow, the whole world would hear exactly who Edward Lansbury really was behind his carefully crafted image. Clara's article appeared online at 6 o'clock in the morning. The headline read, "The waitress who spoke 9 languages and exposed a billionaire's theft." Naomi woke up to her phone just exploding with notifications. Messages from former classmates, old colleagues of her father's, even people she hadn't heard from in years. But more than that, complete strangers from all over the world were sharing the article, commenting on it, really amplifying the story. Clara had just woven everything together masterfully. The restaurant confrontation, Naomi's background, her father's stolen research, and most devastatingly, the audio recording from Edward's penthouse. His voice crystal clear, admitting that he'd removed Andre Brooks's ethical guidelines. His rage-filled outburst about "you people." His complete collapse into the prejudice that he usually just kept hidden. The audio clip went viral within hours. News outlets picked up the story. Social media platforms were just flooded with reactions. Hashtags started popping up. Justice for Andre, speak truth. Language is a bridge. Leia called her at 7 a.m. Have you seen the news? I just can't look away from it. Investors are pulling out of Lansbury Tech. 3 major partnerships dissolved overnight. The board has called an emergency meeting. Leia's voice was filled with grim satisfaction. Edward's empire is crumbling. By midday, Edward was holding a press conference. Naomi watched it on her laptop, Clara sitting beside her in the apartment that they'd agreed was safer than Naomi being alone. Edward stood behind a podium, his usual confidence just strained. Recent allegations have suggested impropriety in my company's acquisition of certain intellectual property. I want to be clear. All of Lansbury Tech's patents and innovations were obtained through perfectly legal means. We value the contributions of all of our consultants, including the late Andre Brooks. A reporter shouted over all the others. Mr. Lansbury, in the audio recording, you admit to removing ethical guidelines from Brooks's original research. How is that even legal? Edward's jaw clenched tight. That recording was obtained without my knowledge or consent. It may not even be authentic. We're exploring all legal remedies. Are you denying that you said those things? I'm saying that the context was completely distorted. This is just a personal attack by a disgruntled former employee who is seeking financial gain. Another reporter spoke up. Naomi Brooks was never your employee. She was a waitress at your hotel, and she refused the $100,000 payment that you offered her. How does that align with her seeking financial gain? The press conference just devolved into total chaos. Edward's answers became more and more defensive, more and more contradictory. His carefully maintained image was just cracking further with each and every question. Clara closed the laptop. He's done. Even if the legal system protects him, public opinion won't. Will the legal system even protect him? Naomi asked. Honestly, maybe. Rich men have been insulating themselves with lawyers and contracts for centuries. Clara's expression hardened. But Dr. Hassan's contacts at the UN came through. The archives prove that your father's original research included those ethical guidelines. They prove his authorship. That's enough to start a formal investigation into intellectual property theft. Naomi's phone rang. Dr. Hassan's name appeared on the screen. Naomi, I have news. The UN's Ethics Committee is launching an inquiry into Project LB200047. Edward's company received substantial grants based on promises to implement Andre's humanitarian framework. If they diverted that money to commercial purposes while removing the ethical components, that's not just theft, it's actually fraud. What does that even mean? It means that government agencies are going to get involved. This isn't just about credit or money anymore. This is about the misuse of international development funds. Within days, the whole situation just accelerated beyond anything that Naomi could have even imagined. Major investors abandoned Lansbury Tech publicly, issuing statements about ethical concerns. The company's stock price just plummeted. Authorities raided the corporate offices, seizing files and computer servers. Naomi watched it all unfold with very mixed feelings. She definitely wanted recognition for her father's work. She wanted Edward to be held accountable for his actions. But actually seeing an entire empire just collapse was surreal, almost frightening in its speed and totality. A week after Clara's article was published, Naomi returned to the Lansbury Hotel, but not to work. Leia had called to say that the entire management structure was being reorganized, but she needed to retrieve her personal items from her locker. The restaurant was closed for renovations. The space looked different in the daylight, just smaller somehow. She walked over to where Edward's table had been, where everything had started with his mocking challenge. The piano was sitting there, silent in the corner. She remembered how the music had stopped when Edward had made his offer, how the entire room had just held its breath. Now the room was completely empty except for her footsteps. Naomi. She turned around. Leia was standing in the doorway, dressed casually for once, instead of her usual manager's attire. I thought you might come by, Leia said. I wanted you to know that the new ownership is completely restructuring everything. They're totally committed to ethical business practices, fair wages, and respecting every single employee. New ownership? Yeah, Edward is being forced to sell. His remaining assets are being liquidated to cover legal fees and settlements. Leia walked closer to her. They want to rename the restaurant. They asked me if you had any suggestions. Naomi looked around the space where she'd been invisible for so long, where she'd served people who never really saw her, where she'd hidden her true self just to survive, and where, finally, she'd refused to stay silent any longer. Brooks Hall, she said quietly, after my father. Leia smiled at her. I'll suggest it. I think they'll really like it. She paused for a moment. What are you going to do now? Naomi had been asking herself the very same question. Job offers had already started arriving. Universities wanting her to come lecture, nonprofits focused on linguistic access, even tech companies that were developing ethical AI. The world that had closed its doors on her when her father died was suddenly opening them all up again. But more than any specific opportunity, she just felt something that she hadn't really experienced in years. Freedom. The freedom to choose her own path instead of just scrambling for survival. The freedom to honor her father's legacy on her own terms. I'm going to finish my degree, Naomi said, and then I'm going to continue my father's work the way that he intended it to be. Language is a bridge, not a barrier. Technology that serves people and not just profits. He'd be so proud of you. I really hope so. As Naomi left the hotel for the very last time, she passed a television in the lobby. A news anchor was reporting on the ongoing investigation into Lansbury Tech. Edward's face filled the screen. No longer confident and commanding, but haggard and defensive. She didn't feel any satisfaction in his downfall, just a quiet sense of completion. This had never been about revenge. It had been about the truth, about refusing to let her father's voice just be erased from history. Outside, the city was moving with its usual relentless energy. Naomi stood on the sidewalk, just feeling the autumn sun on her face. Somewhere in the crowd, people were speaking dozens of different languages, each one carrying their own stories, their own dreams, and their own struggles. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Clara. UN committee officially credited Andre Brooks as the primary author of Project LB200047. Full recognition, full vindication. You did it. Naomi read the message twice, then looked up at the sky. We did it, Dad, she whispered. For the first time in 3 years, the weight that she'd been carrying just lifted. Not completely. Grief and loss don't just disappear, but enough that she could breathe fully, that she could actually imagine a future that was built on something other than just pure survival. She pulled out her father's old notebook from her bag, the one that was filled with linguistic notes in multiple languages. On a blank page, she wrote in careful Mandarin characters, "Truth connects, lies divide." And below it, she added in English, "And speaking the truth, no matter the cost, is how we honor those we love." A young couple walked past her, speaking Arabic. She understood every single word they were saying. They were totally lost, just looking for a specific restaurant. Naomi approached them with a warm smile. "Excuse me," she said in Arabic. "I can help you find where you're going." Their faces just lit up with relief and gratitude. As she gave them directions, the man said, "Your Arabic is so beautiful. Where did you learn it?" "My father taught me," Naomi replied. "He believed that language was the most powerful tool we have for really understanding each other." "Your father was a very wise man." "Yes," Naomi agreed, her heart full. "Yes, he really was." She watched them walk away, then continued down the street herself. Tomorrow would definitely bring new challenges, new opportunities, new ways to just build the bridges that her father had always envisioned. But today, in this moment, she allowed herself to simply be. A woman who spoke 9 languages fluently, a daughter honoring her father's memory, a voice that refused to be silenced. And that, she decided, was exactly enough. 3 months after Edward's empire had just started crumbling, Naomi was standing in her apartment, holding an embossed invitation. The United Nations was hosting a global summit on linguistic unity and digital ethics, and they actually wanted her to be a keynote speaker. Her hands were trembling as she read the formal request. The same institution where her father had worked, where he'd built bridges between nations through words, was now inviting her to continue his legacy. She called Dr. Hassan immediately. "I don't know if I can do this," she told him. "Speaking at the UN, that's just not who I am." "That's exactly who you are," he replied gently. You've already spoken truth to power in front of cameras and in front of the entire world. This is just a larger stage for that same courage. What if I freeze? What if I'm not eloquent enough? Naomi, you speak 9 languages fluently. Eloquence is definitely not your problem here. Fear is, and you've already proven that you're braver than your fear. The next day, Leia met her for coffee. The friendship that had formed during that whole crisis had really deepened into something genuine. Leia had left the Lansbury Hotel entirely and was exploring new opportunities for herself. I have some news for you, Leia said, sliding a folder across the table. Remember how I said the new owners wanted to restructure? They've actually asked me to manage a nonprofit division that's focused on hospitality training for immigrants and refugees. That's absolutely wonderful. And they want you on the advisory board. They're calling it the Andre Brooks Foundation for Linguistic Empowerment. Leia's eyes were just shining. They really want to use your father's vision of language as a bridge to create more opportunities for people who've been marginalized. Naomi opened up the folder. Inside, there were plans for training programs, scholarship opportunities, and partnerships with community organizations. Her father's face was smiling from a memorial page, his biography written with complete respect and accuracy. This is just beautiful, Naomi whispered. This is what he deserved. What you both deserve. That afternoon, Clara stopped by Naomi's apartment with a printed copy of her follow-up article. The piece was titled, "She didn't want fame, she just wanted fairness." This one's different, Clara explained. The first article was all about exposing Edward. This one is about celebrating your father's legacy and your courage. I really wanted people to understand the full story, not just the confrontation, but the love and the principle behind it all. Naomi read through the article, tears just blurring her vision. Clara had interviewed Dr. Hassan, former UN colleagues of her father's, even some of Naomi's old professors from Columbia. Each person spoke about Andre Brooks's brilliance, his kindness, and his unwavering belief that language could really heal divisions. And they spoke about Naomi, not as a victim or a hero, but as a daughter who was honoring her father's memory with such grace and strength. It's perfect, Naomi said. Thank you. Thank you for trusting me with my story. Clara paused for a moment. For what it's worth, this is honestly the most important piece I've ever written. It reminded me why I even became a journalist in the first place. To amplify voices that truly deserve to be heard. As the weeks passed, Naomi started preparing for her UN speech. She wrote and rewrote, trying to capture everything that she wanted to say about language, about connection, and about her father's vision. But every single draft just felt inadequate to her. One evening, feeling frustrated and completely exhausted, she visited her father's grave for the first time since this whole ordeal had even began. The cemetery was so quiet, and autumn leaves were scattered all across the grass. She sat down beside his headstone and spoke to him as if he could actually hear her. I don't know what to say to all those people, Dad, she told him. I'm not you. I'm not a diplomat or a scholar, or someone who naturally inspires others. She wiped her eyes. I'm just someone who refused to stay silent when it really mattered. Is that even enough? The wind rustled softly through the trees. In her pocket, her phone was holding dozens of voice memos. Her father's recorded lessons and his constant encouragement. She pulled it out and played one that she'd marked months ago. Her father's voice emerged, warm and familiar. Naomi, leadership isn't about being perfect. It's about being present. When you speak from your authentic self, when you share your truth without any pretense, people will listen to you. Not because you're extraordinary, but because you're real. She sat with those words until the sun started to set. Then she finally went. She went straight home and wrote her speech in one go, approaching it not as an academic expert or a fervent activist, but simply as herself, a daughter, a former waitress, a woman who had discovered the power of her own voice by steadfastly refusing to let it be silenced. The day of the summit dawned with the crisp, invigorating air of winter and a sky washed clean and bright. Naomi meticulously chose a navy suit with her mother's help. Her mother, whose health had shown marked improvement thanks to better medical care, which Naomi was now able to afford, embraced her tightly before she departed. Your father would be bursting with pride, her mother said, tears welling in her eyes, her voice thick with emotion. Arriving at the United Nations building, Naomi was immediately struck by its overwhelming grandeur and imposing presence. Delegates from every corner of the globe filled the vast assembly hall, creating a vibrant tapestry of cultures and perspectives. Cameras lined the walls, their lenses gleaming, poised to capture every moment of the proceedings. Translation headphones rested on each seat, a silent promise of understanding across linguistic divides. Dr. Hassan greeted her backstage. "Nervous?" he inquired, a twinkle in his eye. "Terrified," Naomi admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "Good," he replied, a reassuring smile spreading across his face. "That means it matters to you, that you understand the gravity of the moment." He paused, reminiscing for a moment. "Your father used to say the very same thing before any big presentation. He'd be shaking like a leaf with nerves, practically vibrating with anxiety. But then he'd step onto that stage and transform into the most confident, commanding person in the entire room." Leia and Clara appeared, having flown in specifically to lend their support. "You've got this," Leia said simply, her words carrying the weight of unwavering belief. Clara gently squeezed Naomi's hand. "Just speak from your heart, Naomi. That's what people need to hear. That's what will truly resonate." When Naomi's name was announced, she walked onto the stage, her legs feeling remarkably unsteady, yet her steps remained resolute, unwavering in their purpose. The assembly hall stretched out before her, an ocean of faces turned in her direction, their eyes fixed upon her. She reached the podium and gazed out at the assembled audience, her heart pounding in her chest. Then, taking a deep breath, she began, "Good morning. Buenos dias. Bonjour. Sabah al-khair. Zao shang hao." She delivered the greeting in 9 different languages, her voice clear, steady, and strong, cutting through the expectant silence. A murmur of interest rippled through the audience, their attention fully captured. "My name is Naomi Brooks, and my father was Andre Brooks. Many of you knew him," she continued, her voice filled with a quiet dignity. "He worked in this very building for 15 years, as a translator, an interpreter, tirelessly bridging the gaps between people who thought they had absolutely nothing in common." She paused, taking a moment to find her rhythm, to gather her thoughts. "I'm not here today because I'm special, because I possess some extraordinary talent. I'm here because I learned something truly important from a painful, deeply personal experience." She emphasized each word, wanting to convey the weight of her message. Language is power, but not the kind of power that seeks to dominate or diminish others. It's the power to connect, to understand, to see our shared humanity shining through across every border and every barrier that we construct. She seamlessly transitioned into Mandarin, addressing the Chinese delegates directly, her pronunciation impeccable. She quoted a classical phrase, a timeless proverb about unity and diversity, its meaning echoing across the vast hall. Then, without missing a beat, she moved to Arabic, speaking eloquently about the ancient tradition of hospitality and welcoming strangers, a value deeply ingrained in the culture. She continued, flowing effortlessly through French, Spanish, Russian, and Swahili, weaving between languages with a natural grace, making each and every delegate feel seen, heard, and included in the conversation. "My father believed that technology could amplify this power," she continued in English, her voice gaining strength. "He envisioned systems that would help refugees communicate with doctors, that would allow isolated elders to connect with their grandchildren across continents, that would break down the walls that language so often builds between us, dividing us when we should be uniting." Her voice grew even stronger, resonating with conviction. But he also understood that technology is only as ethical as the people who control it, as the people who wield its power. When innovation serves profit over people, when it becomes a mere commodity instead of a bridge, we lose something essential, something that makes us human. We lose our empathy, our ability to connect with one another on a deeper level. She proceeded to tell her story, not dwelling on the pain and heartache, but focusing instead on the underlying principle, the unwavering truth that guided her actions. She spoke about working as a waitress, forced to conceal her education and her abilities, about the agonizing challenge that forced her to choose between remaining silent and speaking the truth, about discovering her father's stolen work, and about her courageous decision to speak up, regardless of the potential cost. I didn't expose Edward Lansbury because I wanted revenge, because I sought to punish him for his wrongdoings, she declared, her voice ringing with sincerity. I did it because my father's voice deserved to be heard, to be recognized, and because silence in the face of injustice makes us all complicit, making us a part of the problem. The assembly hall fell into complete silence, every breath held, every eye fixed intently upon her. When power speaks, it often divides us, creating rifts and fostering animosity. It tells us that we're different, separate, unequal, driving us further apart. But when empathy speaks, when we choose understanding over judgment, connection over isolation, we remember our shared humanity, the ties that bind us together. We remember that we're all trying to navigate this same human experience, this complex and often challenging journey. We're all searching for dignity, for purpose, for the simple right to be heard, to have our voices acknowledged and valued. She concluded her speech with her father's favorite phrase, spoken in each of the 9 languages she had used throughout her address. Language is not a wall between us. It's a window, and every time we open one, we see a little more of ourselves, we gain a deeper understanding of who we are. The assembly erupted in thunderous applause, a wave of sound that crashed over her. Delegates rose to their feet, offering a standing ovation, their faces beaming with admiration and respect. The ovation thundered through the hall, shaking the very foundations of the building. Naomi stood at the podium, overwhelmed by emotion, a lump forming in her throat. She felt her father's presence, a warm and comforting sensation, like a gentle hand resting on her shoulder. As she left the stage, delegates surrounded her, eager to express their appreciation and to learn more about her work. A woman from Kenya inquired about starting similar linguistic programs in her own country, seeking to empower her community through language. A Japanese official wanted to discuss the ethical implications of AI translation, seeking to ensure that technology serves humanity. Students who had been watching the live stream sent messages, eager to learn from her experience and to contribute to her cause. Dr. Hassan found her in the midst of the crowd, his eyes shining with pride and admiration. "You didn't just honor your father today, Naomi," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "You became the bridge he always knew you could be, a symbol of hope and understanding in a world that desperately needs it." 6 months later, Naomi stood in front of a classroom that had no walls, a classroom that spanned the globe. The screen before her displayed 23 faces from 15 different countries, all connected through the Andre Brooks Foundation's online learning platform, a testament to her father's enduring legacy. "Today, we're going to learn how stories translate across cultures," she said, smiling warmly at the eager young faces. "We're going to explore the nuances of language and the ways in which stories connect us, even when we speak different tongues." A girl from Morocco raised her hand, speaking in hesitant French, her voice filled with anticipation. Naomi listened attentively, then helped her translate the story into English, carefully explaining the cultural context that made it so meaningful. A boy from Brazil offered a Portuguese tale next, and the class worked together, collaborating to find equivalent expressions in their various languages, bridging the gaps between cultures and fostering understanding. This had become Naomi's life, her passion, her purpose. Teaching, connecting, building the foundation her father had so passionately dreamed of. The Andre Brooks Foundation for Linguistic Empowerment had experienced rapid growth, fueled by ethical investors, generous donations from people who had been deeply moved by her story, and strategic partnerships with universities worldwide. Leah served as the foundation's director of operations, her extensive experience in hospitality management translating perfectly to the coordination of global programs, ensuring that everything ran smoothly. Clara documented their work, chronicling their journey through articles and a book she was writing about language justice and the transformative power of speaking truth, amplifying their message to the world. After the class concluded, Naomi walked to the foundation's new headquarters, modest offices located in a community center in Queens, not far from the neighborhood where she had spent her childhood. The walls were adorned with photographs of students, maps illustrating their reach across continents, and a large portrait of her father that invariably drew the attention of visitors, a silent tribute to his enduring influence. On her desk sat the framed quote her father had loved so dearly: "Understanding is the truest wealth," a constant reminder of his guiding philosophy. Her phone buzzed, signaling the arrival of a message from Dr. Hassan. "One of your students just got accepted to Columbia's linguistics program with a full scholarship," the message exclaimed. 3 others received job offers as translators for refugee services. "You're changing lives, Naomi, making a real difference in the world." Naomi smiled, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. She texted back, "We're changing lives, Dr. Hassan. This was never about me alone. It's always been about something bigger." That afternoon, Naomi received an unexpected visitor. The receptionist called to inform her that someone named Edward Lansbury was in the lobby, requesting to see her. Naomi's initial instinct was to refuse, to turn him away without a second thought. She hadn't seen or spoken to Edward since that fateful night in his penthouse, the night that had changed the course of her life. His company had been dismantled, his patents stripped, his reputation utterly destroyed. She'd heard rumors that he had lost the majority of his fortune in legal settlements and investigations, paying the price for his actions. But curiosity, and perhaps a faint whisper of compassion, prompted her to agree to meet him. Edward looked remarkably different, a stark contrast to the man she remembered. The polished billionaire was gone, replaced by a man in worn jeans and a simple jacket, his appearance disheveled and subdued. His silver hair needed cutting, and his face bore the deep lines of exhaustion and something that might have been regret, a hint of remorse etched into his features. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Naomi," he said immediately, standing awkwardly in her office doorway, avoiding her gaze. "I don't deserve forgiveness, not after what I did, but I needed to see what you built, to witness the good that has come from my wrongdoings." Naomi gestured toward a chair, inviting him to sit. "Why?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Because I need to understand what I destroyed, the magnitude of the damage I inflicted," he replied, his voice heavy with remorse. He sat down heavily, as if burdened by the weight of his past actions. "I've spent the last 6 months in therapy, trying to figure out how I became the person I was. The person who mocked you, who stole your father's work, who built an empire on taking credit for other people's brilliance." "And what did you learn?" Naomi asked, her eyes fixed on him. "That I was afraid," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Terrified of being ordinary, of not mattering, of fading into obscurity. So I took and took, believing that accumulation would somehow fill the emptiness inside, that wealth would somehow validate my existence." He looked at her directly, his eyes filled with a raw honesty. "I destroyed your father's legacy out of greed, consumed by a desperate need to feel important. I destroyed your dignity out of insecurity, lashing out because I felt threatened. And I almost destroyed myself out of cowardice, lacking the courage to confront my own flaws." Naomi listened without speaking, allowing him to unburden himself, to confront the truth of his actions. "I donated what's left of my money," Edward continued, his voice cracking with emotion. "Not to your foundation, Naomi. I know you wouldn't accept it from me, not after everything that's happened. But to organizations like yours, organizations that are working to make a positive impact on the world, and I did it under my mother's name so it wouldn't be tainted by mine." He paused, taking a shaky breath. "It's not enough, Naomi. It will never be enough to undo the damage I caused. But it's what I can do, the only way I can atone for my sins." "Why tell me this?" Naomi asked, her voice soft but firm. "Because you deserve to know that your courage didn't just save your father's memory, it saved me from continuing to be a monster, from perpetuating the cycle of greed and destruction," he replied, his voice filled with genuine remorse. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to become someone worthy of the second chance you inadvertently gave me, striving to be a better person. Naomi studied him intently, searching for any sign of deceit. She saw genuine remorse, a flicker of hope in his eyes, but she also recognized the privilege of a man who would ultimately recover from ruin in ways that others never could. Yet, she also saw a human being grappling with his own failures, struggling to come to terms with the consequences of his actions. "I can't give you absolution, Edward," she said finally, her voice filled with a quiet dignity. "That's not mine to give. My father's work speaks for itself now. It stands as a testament to his brilliance. And your role in trying to erase it is part of the public record, a reminder of the consequences of greed and ambition." "I know, Naomi. I know," he replied, his voice filled with regret. "But I hope you find a way to do better, to be better, not for recognition, not for praise, but because it's the right thing to do, because it's what we owe to each other." Edward nodded slowly and stood to leave. At the door, he turned back, his expression somber. "Your father was brilliant, Naomi. I knew it even as I was stealing his work, even as I was trying to claim his ideas as my own. I'm sorry I never told him that when he was alive. I'm sorry I never acknowledged his genius." After he left, Naomi sat quietly in her office, lost in thought. She didn't know if Edward's redemption was genuine, if his remorse was truly sincere, or if it was just another carefully crafted performance designed to elicit sympathy. But she realized it didn't matter, that his motives were ultimately irrelevant. Her purpose wasn't about him anymore. It wasn't about seeking revenge or validation. It was about the students she taught, the bridges she built, the legacy she honored, the positive impact she was making on the world. That evening, Naomi visited the rebranded restaurant, now officially called Brooks Hall, a tribute to her father's memory. The space had been completely redesigned with input from community members and former staff, creating a welcoming and inclusive atmosphere. The walls featured a vibrant mural depicting children of every background holding books that glowed with different scripts, symbolizing the power of language to unite and empower. At the center of the mural was a portrait of her father at his UN desk, headphones on, a gentle smile on his face as he translated words that would help nations understand each other, a constant reminder of his vision. Leia met her there for dinner, and they sat at a table by the window, the glittering Manhattan skyline stretching out beyond the glass, a breathtaking backdrop to their conversation. "Remember when you were invisible here, Naomi?" Leia asked, a hint of amusement in her voice. "Every day," Naomi replied, smiling ruefully. "But I don't regret it anymore, Leia. That experience taught me something incredibly important. That dignity isn't given by others. It's not something that can be bestowed upon you. It's something we carry ourselves, something we cultivate within, something that no one can take away from us. Your father would be so proud of you, Naomi," Leia said, her voice filled with warmth and admiration. Naomi's eyes filled with tears, her heart overflowing with emotion. "I hope so, Leia. I try to honor him in everything I do, to live up to the values he instilled in me." Later that night, back in her apartment, Naomi opened her laptop, a sense of accomplishment washing over her. She'd finally finished the research paper she'd abandoned 3 years ago, the paper that had been so deeply intertwined with her father's legacy. "Language is a bridge of empathy," she typed, her fingers flying across the keyboard. Dr. Hassan had reviewed it and submitted it for publication in a prestigious linguistics journal, a testament to its scholarly merit. But more importantly, she had expanded it into a manifesto for the Foundation, creating detailed guidelines for ethical language technology and principles for using linguistic access as a tool for justice rather than profit, ensuring that her father's vision would be realized in a responsible and equitable manner. Everything her father had envisioned, now codified and ready to guide future innovations, a legacy that would endure for generations to come. She pulled out her father's old voice recorder, a relic from the past, and recorded a message of her own, her voice filled with emotion. "Dad, I did it," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I finished what you started. I carried your dream forward. Not exactly how you planned, maybe, but in a way that honors your vision, in a way that I hope would make you proud." She paused, gathering her thoughts. The foundation is growing, Dad. Students from 20 countries are learning languages, finding opportunities, building bridges, just like you taught me. Her voice wavered, tears streaming down her face. I miss you every day, Dad, but I'm not lost anymore. I know who I am, I know my purpose. She took a deep breath, regaining her composure. Someone who listens, who speaks truth, who believes that understanding is the truest wealth, the most valuable treasure we can possess. You taught me that, Dad, and I'll spend my life teaching it to others, ensuring that your legacy lives on. She saved the recording and looked at the photo of them together at the UN, taken when she was just 16, a cherished memento from a time when the future stretched out before them, bright and full of possibility. Both of them smiling, her father's hand resting gently on her shoulder, a silent promise of love and support. That future had taken a different path than either of them expected, a path marked by loss and hardship, but it had ultimately led her here, to purpose, to impact, to a life built on principle rather than survival, a life worthy of her father's memory. The next morning, Naomi prepared for another day of classes, her heart filled with anticipation. But first, she stopped at a community center in the Bronx, where she was teaching introductory Mandarin to recent immigrants, helping them to navigate their new lives in a foreign land. A young woman approached her after class, her eyes shining with gratitude, speaking nervously. Miss Brooks, I wanted to thank you, she said, her voice filled with emotion. I came here from China 2 years ago and could barely communicate. I felt so lost and isolated. Now I'm starting college, I'm building a future for myself, and it's all because you taught me that knowing multiple languages isn't just practical. It's powerful. It's a key that unlocks countless doors. Naomi hugged her tightly, her heart swelling with pride. You always had that power, honey, she said, her voice filled with warmth. I just helped you see it. I just helped you find your voice. As she walked home through the bustling city streets, she noticed the languages flowing around her. A symphony of voices that filled the air. Spanish from a bodega owner, bargaining with a customer. Arabic from teenagers laughing together, sharing jokes and stories. Russian from an elderly couple, reminiscing about their past. All these voices, all these stories, all these people trying to be understood, trying to connect with one another. Her phone buzzed with a notification, signaling the arrival of a video message from one of the foundation students in Kenya, speaking in Swahili about how the program had helped her become a translator for her village's medical clinic, bridging the communication gap and saving lives. Naomi watched the video with a full heart, tears streaming down her face. This was her father's dream realized, not through patents or profits, but through people connecting, understanding, and lifting each other up, creating a more just and equitable world. She arrived at her apartment and saw a package waiting for her, a surprise that brought a smile to her face. Inside was an advanced copy of Clara's book, a testament to their shared journey, titled Voices That Bridge, One Woman's Fight for Her Father's Legacy. On the dedication page it read, For Andre Brooks, who taught us that language is a window, not a wall, and for Naomi Brooks, who opened that window for the world to see through, illuminating the path towards understanding and empathy. Naomi held the book close to her heart, feeling the full weight of everything that had happened, the culmination of years of struggle and sacrifice, the pain of loss, the courage to speak, the vindication of truth, the joy of purpose fulfilled. She opened her father's old notebook to a blank page, its worn leather cover a testament to the countless stories it held, and wrote in careful script, alternating between languages, weaving together different voices in a tapestry of understanding. Language is a bridge. Truth is a foundation. Love is the blueprint. She paused, reflecting on the power of words. And every word we speak can either divide or connect, can either build walls or tear them down. I choose connection today and always. I choose to build bridges instead of walls. I choose love over fear. She looked at her reflection in the window, seeing not the invisible waitress she'd once been, the woman who had been forced to conceal her identity, but the woman she'd become, a woman of strength, resilience, and unwavering purpose. A teacher, an advocate, a voice for those still finding theirs. a champion for those who had been silenced. And in that reflection, she saw her father's smile, a silent affirmation of her path, a reminder of his enduring love. The work would continue, the foundation would grow, more students would learn that their voices mattered, that understanding was possible, that bridges could be built one word at a time. This was legacy, not wealth or fame, but impact that rippled outward, touching lives in ways both visible and invisible, creating a world where everyone had the opportunity to be heard and understood. Naomi smiled and spoke softly in Mandarin, a phrase her father had taught her long ago, a timeless wisdom that echoed through the ages. "When you speak with love, the whole world understands," she whispered, her voice filled with conviction. Outside her window, the city hummed with countless voices, each one carrying stories worth hearing, each one deserving of recognition. And Naomi knew that for the rest of her life, she would work tirelessly to make sure those voices were heard, understood, and valued, to create a world where everyone had the chance to connect and communicate. Because that's what it meant to honor her father, to carry on his legacy. That's what it meant to build bridges, to tear down walls. That's what it meant to choose understanding over silence, connection over isolation, love over fear. And that, she decided, was the truest wealth of all, the most valuable treasure a person could possess. If someone stole everything your father built and then mocked you for existing, would you have the courage to speak your truth, even knowing it might cost you everything you have left? If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who refuse to stay silent, about the power of courage and the importance of fighting for what is right.